There is a brutal truth in the corporate world. The suits think automation is self-sustaining magic, while the people keeping that magic from exploding are just disposable tools. When the new boss smirked and called me replaceable, I did not scream or warn him. I just smiled, left my access key, and walked away. Hearing a billion-dollar logistics empire crumble under its own arrogance in exactly 15 minutes is a truly beautiful symphony. Hello to the wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to operate. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these revenge tales for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments below. I am 34 years old, and until a very specific Friday morning, I was the lead routing algorithm architect at AeroVantage Express. AeroVantage was not just any standard courier service. We were a billion-dollar logistics empire based in the heart of Seattle. We did not deliver fast fashion items or cheap, disposable electronics. We moved things that mattered. We transported highly volatile aviation components across the country. We shipped delicate, experimental medical devices. We delivered human organs for immediate transplant surgeries. If one of our trucks took a wrong turn into a blizzard, or if a cargo plane was routed into a major storm cell, people did not just get frustrated about a late package. People died. The stakes were absolute, and the margin for error was exactly 0%. The corporate office was a towering monument to late-stage startup arrogance. It was a stiflingly polished, aggressively modern space filled with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, ergonomic chairs that cost more than a reliable used car, and executives who truly believed that stringing buzzwords together could magically bend reality. The absolute pinnacle of this corporate delusion was a man named Trenton Vance. Trenton was our newly appointed Vice President of Operations. He was exactly the kind of man who measured human efficiency in complex systems through colorful, completely meaningless pie charts on a PowerPoint presentation. He had absolutely zero background in actual on-the-ground logistics or software engineering, but he was utterly obsessed with the concept of artificial intelligence optimization. To Trenton, the core technical staff members were not the vital foundation of the company. We were simply bloated line items on a financial spreadsheet, sitting there ripe for drastic budget cuts. He wore sharply tailored suits that screamed inherited wealth and spoke in an exhausting stream of corporate jargon that completely masked his profound, dangerous ignorance of how our physical world actually functioned. The breaking point happened during our weekly operational review on a gloomy, overcast Friday morning. The massive conference room was packed tight with department heads and a few terrified junior engineers. I had just finished presenting my quarterly system risk report. It was a deeply detailed, heavily researched analysis explaining exactly why our routing infrastructure required intense manual context updates every single day. I explained the countless, unpredictable variables, unplanned roadwork schedules in rural areas, sudden, violent weather shifts in the Rocky Mountains, localized labor strikes at regional transit hubs. These were things a raw, unfiltered algorithm could never anticipate without constant human guidance and historical intuition. Trenton leaned back in his expensive leather chair. Steepling his manicured fingers together, he let out a loud, highly theatrical, patronizing sigh that echoed loudly across the completely silent room. He looked at my meticulously compiled report as if it were a toddler's messy finger painting. "Do you honestly expect us to believe that this archaic, manual hand-holding is actually necessary? It sounds to me like you are simply overcomplicating a very basic process just to justify your own bloated paycheck." I stared at him, keeping my breathing completely even and measured. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice in defense. The sheer, terrifying audacity of his statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He stood up, walking briskly to the front of the room to project his own single slide. It was entirely blank except for the giant, glowing logo of a flashy, unproven third-party technology vendor. Effective immediately. AeroVantage is transitioning to a fully autonomous, self-learning artificial intelligence routing protocol, Trenton announced to the crowded room, beaming with unearned pride. We bought it straight off the shelf. It is entirely plug and play. It does not need scheduled coffee breaks. It does not complain about localized weather data. And it certainly does not need a highly paid architect to sit here and babysit it. He turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were cold, filled with the specific petty cruelty of a mediocre man who finally has absolute power over someone significantly smarter than him. "You are just an outdated puzzle piece," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "In this modern era, absolutely anyone can be replaced. You are terminated, effective immediately. Building security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items." I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not deliver a passionate, desperate speech about how the entire company would burn to the ground the moment I left the building. The truth is, arguing with a fool only proves there are two fools in the room. I looked at his smug, incredibly punchable face and felt nothing but a profound, icy calm wash over me. I reached out to my workstation laptop. With a rapid, practiced motion, I hit the exact keyboard shortcut to compile and securely save the absolute final state of my routing algorithm. I closed the silver lid. The soft, metallic click of the magnetic latch sounded exactly like a judge's gavel dropping in the dead silent room. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small, heavy metal flash drive. It contained the complete, comprehensive handover guide. It held every single fail-safe protocol, every manual override code, and the detailed architectural map of the fragile digital ecosystem I had meticulously built and maintained for the last several years. I stood up smoothly, walked directly over to where Trenton was standing, and placed the drive gently on the polished oak table right in front of him. The rest of the office was entirely frozen in shock. A few of the younger engineers, including Wyatt, a bright-eyed, brilliant intern who actually understood the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the code we managed, watched me with absolute horror. Wyatt looked like he desperately wanted to say something, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. He knew exactly what Trenton had just blindly destroyed. But Trenton just smirked, without even bothering to glance at the warning label printed on the drive. He scooped it up with one hand and carelessly tossed it into the deep, dark bottom drawer of his desk. He slammed the drawer shut. I offered him a polite, totally empty smile. Then, I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. The walk back to my desk felt like drifting through a silent vacuum. The usual, frantic hum of server cooling units and the aggressive clatter of mechanical keyboards seemed entirely muted. I found an empty cardboard box near the main supply closet and began the remarkably brief process of erasing my entire existence from the company. I did not pack any technical notebooks, backup hard drives, or printed operational manuals. I had already left them everything they needed on that silver desk in the executive suite. I carefully lifted my favorite heavy ceramic coffee mug, its inner rim permanently stained from thousands of late-night espresso shots. Next, I gently picked up the vibrant green pothos plant I had meticulously nurtured on the corner of my workstation for 5 long years. Its trailing vines had spilled over the side of the gray cubicle, serving as a tiny, stubborn rebellion of living, breathing life in a completely sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory. Finally, I placed my rigid plastic employee access badge perfectly flat on top of my keyboard. It rested deliberately over the escape key. I heard the anxious, hesitant shuffling of feet right behind me. It was Wyatt. The young software intern looked terribly pale, clutching a diagnostic tablet tightly to his chest, as if it were a bulletproof vest. He darted his eyes nervously toward the thick glass walls of the executive suites before daring to speak. "Are you really just leaving?" Wyatt whispered, his voice trembling slightly under the weight of the realization. "What about the context updates? The artificial intelligence protocol they bought is entirely blank out of the box. Will the system actually hold together without your daily manual feeds?" I looked at his earnest, terrified face. He was the only person in that entire bloated department who actually understood the immense, fragile architecture we managed. I offered him a soft, entirely genuine smile as I picked up my cardboard box. Balloons fly very high when there is no one holding the string. Wyatt, I replied quietly. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the grand glass atrium. The heavy steel elevator doors slid open to receive me. I stepped inside, and the soft, musical chime of the doors sliding shut felt incredibly definitive. It was the absolute punctuation mark at the very end of a long, exhausting sentence. The elevator descended swiftly to the ground floor lobby. The armed security guards at the front desk gave me a brief, polite nod, completely unaware that the architect who ensured their payroll processed correctly had just been declared a redundant piece of machinery. I pushed my way through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the sprawling corporate parking lot. Seattle is internationally famous for its endless gray rain, but on that particular morning, the sky had broken wide open, brilliant. Warm sunlight washed entirely over the black asphalt. I stood next to my sedan, closed my eyes, and took a massive, deep breath of the crisp, salty air drifting off Puget Sound. The heavy, invisible burden of managing $1 billion in constant liability completely vanished from my shoulders. The sheer, intoxicating relief washing over my body was almost dizzying. I placed my potted plant safely in the passenger seat, buckled it in out of sheer muscle memory, and drove away from the compound. I did not speed. I drove at exactly the legal limit, thoroughly enjoying the quiet rhythm of the highway. I eventually pulled into the gravel lot of a quiet, unpretentious cafe tucked right against the edge of Lake Washington. I ordered a hot Americano, completely black, and carried it out to a secluded wooden table on the empty patio overlooking the rippling blue water. I took out my smartphone. With a few deliberate, sweeping gestures, I completely disabled all corporate enterprise notifications. No more screaming emergency system alerts. No more frantic text messages from regional warehouse managers. No more glowing red tracking dashboards. The absolute only application I left running in the background was a heavily encrypted, personal open-source monitor I had built several years ago. It only observed public logistics radio frequencies and open data streams. It could not command or alter anything. It merely watched the world move. While I was enjoying the rich, bitter, earthy taste of my coffee in the warm sun, a drastically different scene was actively unfolding back in the climate-controlled server room of AeroVantage. Trenton had not wasted a single spare second. Driven by an insatiable, ego-fueled hunger to prove his own genius to the board of directors, he stood directly behind the central command console and officially authorized the master switch. He gave the newly purchased artificial intelligence full, unrestricted administrative control over the entire national routing grid. Within 10 minutes, every single employee in the building received a highly enthusiastic, incredibly dense company-wide email from Trenton. It boldly declared the official dawn of a revolutionary era of intelligent automation, promising unprecedented cost reductions and flawless operational efficiency. What Trenton fundamentally failed to grasp was the harsh, basic reality of machine learning. An artificial intelligence program does not magically invent safe shipping routes out of thin air. It merely processes the data it is given, but raw, unfiltered geographic data is a chaotic, deadly mess. The flashy new software always relied implicitly on a hidden, foundational data layer. It depended entirely on a complex noise filter that I had to manually tune every 4 hours. My custom filters were the absolute only things removing the catastrophic blind spots from the map. I was the person who told the digital system that a major interstate bridge in Ohio was completely shut down for emergency structural repairs. I was the one who manually flagged the sudden, unannounced labor strike at the massive Memphis cargo hub. I was the one who translated confusing hyperlocal traffic ordinances, so a massive 70-foot tractor-trailer full of jet engines would not get permanently wedged underneath a low historic brick overpass in Boston. Trenton had just given a highly energetic, incredibly fast, completely blind child the absolute steering control to a massive, speeding freight train. The entire global system still looked completely stable on the surface. The colorful pie charts on his executive monitors were likely glowing a reassuring, bright green, but underneath the hood, the vital, human-curated data cache was quietly expiring. The digital protection barrier was slowly dissolving into the ether. The silent countdown had officially begun, ticking away mercilessly behind the shiny modern interfaces. Exactly 15 minutes after I walked through those heavy glass doors, the very first digital domino fell. It started small, a minor localized anomaly in the sprawling Midwestern grid that most automated trackers would normally ignore. A massive fleet of heavy-duty refrigerated trucks, currently carrying highly sensitive, extremely fragile frozen medical supplies across the state of Colorado, suddenly received a completely erratic rerouting ping. The shiny new autonomous software aggressively instructed the veteran drivers to abruptly exit the main interstate, navigate into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Denver, and circle a small residential roundabout exactly 4 times. After completing this dizzying, utterly pointless maneuver, the navigation screen confidently ordered them to drive directly down a narrow, unpaved alleyway that ended abruptly in a solid brick wall. Inside the heavily monitored Central Command Center, a junior dispatcher flagged the bizarre routing behavior immediately. He nervously brought the flashing tablet to the executive desk, expecting an immediate course correction. Trenton Vance did not even bother to look closely at the flashing red screen. He waved his manicured hand dismissively, pausing only to straighten his expensive silk tie. "Ignore the manual complaints," Trenton instructed the dispatcher with a loud, booming voice that echoed off the glass walls. "Tell those drivers to follow the exact path projected on their screens. The new system is simply learning the optimal traffic patterns through real-time physical testing. We must trust the artificial intelligence. Stop second-guessing progress." He was completely blindly convinced that a multi-million-dollar software suite could not possibly make a foundational error. Right at minute 18 of my newfound freedom, I was comfortably settling into Chapter 3 of a rather excellent mystery novel. The gentle breeze coming off the lake was absolutely perfect, carrying the faint scent of pine trees and fresh water. Suddenly, my smartphone, resting peacefully beside my half-empty coffee cup, began to aggressively vibrate against the wooden table. It was not a casual text message. It was a massive, blaring automated emergency call from the central AeroVantage server. The unique, high-pitched ringtone clearly indicated that the National Routing Protocol was currently experiencing a severe, catastrophic digital bottleneck. I looked down at the flashing red caller identification screen for exactly 2 seconds. Then, I calmly picked up the phone, flipped it face down on the table to completely muffle the loud buzzing, and went right back to reading my book. The afternoon sun felt wonderfully warm on my skin. And the plot of my novel was just getting incredibly interesting. Back in the aggressively air-conditioned headquarters of AeroVantage, the atmosphere was rapidly deteriorating. The massive, wall-sized distribution charts, which Trenton loved to show off, were beginning to drastically shift. The calming, uniform ocean of bright green performance indicators suddenly flickered, rippled violently, and began bleeding into a sickly warning yellow. The operational chaos was rapidly escalating from the ground level straight up into the sky. High above the Midwestern plains, several massive cargo planes carrying millions of dollars in delicate aviation components were suddenly denied emergency landing clearance at their primary transit hubs. The artificial intelligence had independently recalculated the runway load capacities using flawed environmental logic and erroneously determined that the massive, reinforced concrete strips were suddenly too short to handle the incoming weight. Highly experienced pilots were abruptly forced into dangerous holding patterns, burning through thousands of gallons of expensive aviation fuel while screaming intensely at thoroughly confused air traffic controllers. Down in the engineering pit, Wyatt was desperately typing across 3 different mechanical keyboards, his eyes wide with rising terror. He completely bypassed the locked administrative dashboards and dug straight down into the raw data stream feeding the new intelligence protocol. What he found buried in the code made the blood completely drain from his young, panicked face. The incredibly expensive, state-of-the-art artificial intelligence was essentially driving blindfolded. Without my highly specific daily noise filter to guide its decision-making process, the system had desperately searched the network for a foundational baseline map. It had aggressively latched onto the absolute largest geographical database it could find in the deep company archives. Unfortunately, that specific baseline map was raw, completely unedited, and officially dated from the year 2018. The state-of-the-art system was aggressively routing our entire modern fleet through a physical world that no longer existed. It was commanding thousands of heavily loaded delivery vehicles to drive straight into massive, long-term metropolitan construction zones. It was forcing confused logistics drivers to take non-existent highway exits that had been totally demolished years ago. Even worse, it was confidently directing high-value cargo vans straight toward rural county roads that were currently submerged under 3 feet of seasonal floodwater. The intelligence was acting incredibly fast, sending out tens of thousands of disastrous routing commands per second, completely and utterly convinced of its own absolute accuracy. The yellow warning lights on the massive command board suddenly flashed into a blinding, terrifying crimson red. High-decibel warning sirens, which had not been triggered in that building for over half a decade, began to wail loudly through the open-plan office. Trenton finally stopped smiling. A cold, heavy sweat broke out across his forehead, completely ruining his perfectly styled hair. He lunged toward the main console, his previous corporate confidence entirely evaporating into raw, unfiltered panic as he watched his career actively disintegrate on the screens. "Turn it off!" Trenton screamed, his voice cracking loudly as he frantically slammed his clenched fists against the polished desk. "Shut down the artificial intelligence right now. Cut the server connection and immediately revert the entire grid back to the old legacy system." Wyatt stopped typing. He slowly stood up from his workstation, looking at the terrified vice president with a heavy mixture of absolute pity and profound exhaustion. The young intern did not yell. He did not run. He spoke in a devastatingly quiet, perfectly clear voice that carried perfectly over the wailing emergency alarms. "We cannot revert it, sir," Wyatt stated plainly, looking directly into Trenton's wide, panicked eyes. "The old legacy system does not actually run independently. It never did. The old system inherently ran on Paisley. Cascade failure is never a graceful or quiet event. It is a brutal, unrelenting digital avalanche. It does not pause. It does not negotiate." Within exactly 15 minutes of the initial digital anomalies, the entire logistical backbone of AeroVantage Express became completely and utterly paralyzed. The massive operational grid collapsed across 14 different states simultaneously. The digital disease moved substantially faster than a raging forest fire. Heavy freight trucks simply stopped moving on the major interstate highways. The automated routing protocol became completely overwhelmed by massive amounts of contradictory data. In a desperate attempt to resolve the geographic conflicts, the artificial intelligence initiated immediate emergency shutdown procedures on the vehicle engines. Massive commercial transport rigs, currently carrying tens of millions of dollars in highly classified aerospace technology, were suddenly forced into a hard stall. They were entirely stranded. They sat completely dead in the middle of the scorching Mojave Desert. The drivers lost all communication with the central hub. They had absolutely zero exact geographic coordinates. They were effectively turned into heavy ghost ships lost in an infinite ocean of burning sand. Inside the central command center, the massive communications switchboards lit up exactly like a terrifying, chaotic fireworks display. Premium VIP clients began calling the emergency corporate lines directly. These were not easily ignored retail customers waiting for a delayed pair of shoes. These were elite aerospace contractors. These were highly aggressive hospital administrators demanding their life-saving medical equipment. They screamed viciously through the phone receivers. They threatened immediate, crippling corporate lawsuits. They demanded exact delivery timelines that no one in the building could actually provide. The estimated financial damages were aggressively scaling by the second. Trenton Vance was no longer the arrogant, perfectly groomed executive who had proudly fired me just a short time ago, the color had completely and totally drained from his face. He looked exactly like a terrified ghost suffocating in a highly expensive tailored suit. He frantically scrambled around his expansive, beautifully polished oak desk. He violently tore open his heavy wooden drawers. He sent incredibly expensive pens, pristine business cards, and empty coffee cups flying haphazardly across the thick carpet. His shaking, sweaty hands finally grasped the small, heavy metal flash drive. It was the exact same drive I had carefully placed in front of him, the very same drive he had arrogantly tossed aside without a single glance. He shoved it violently into the high-speed data port of his executive terminal. He was desperately praying for a massive, glowing graphical interface. He wanted a button that said, "Fix everything." He aggressively double-clicked the primary digital directory. The folder opened on his large monitor. It was completely empty, except for one single, solitary document. It was a standard portable document format file. The title was painfully, devastatingly clear. It read, "Comprehensive Risk Report regarding the immediate termination of core architectural personnel." There was no magic software patch. There was no hidden digital undo button. There was only a written testament to his own monumental, catastrophic stupidity. Panic instantly mutated into absolute, unfiltered hysteria. Trenton sprinted blindly out of his glass office. He physically grabbed the nearest senior developers by the shoulders. He mobilized the entire remaining information technology department. He stood directly behind their chairs, screaming orders at the absolute top of his lungs. He aggressively demanded they write brute force override commands. He needed them to forcefully seize manual control of the national grid immediately. The terrified engineers hammered furiously at their mechanical keyboards. They sweat profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. They desperately bypassed standard security protocols. They tried to slice their code directly into the foundational mainframe. Every single attempt slammed violently into a massive, impenetrable digital concrete wall. The terminal screens flashed a bright, blinding white light. Then, they displayed a harsh, undeniable red warning message. Access denied. The core foundational architecture was never designed to be easily hacked. It strictly required a highly specific, totally unforgeable biometric security certificate. It required the physical fingerprint and the precise retinal scan of the lead routing algorithm architect. Without my physical presence in that building, the system simply treated their desperate override attempts as hostile foreign cyber attacks. It locked them out entirely. It permanently sealed the digital blast doors. The sheer, suffocating despair reached its absolute peak. Trenton was visibly hyperventilating. His chest heaved wildly as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. Out of pure, blind, humiliating desperation, he snatched the red emergency telephone directly off the central command console. He rapidly dialed my personal cellular number. I was still sitting incredibly comfortably by the peaceful lake. The water was glistening beautifully in the bright afternoon sun. I watched the corporate caller identification flash brightly on my screen. I let it ring exactly 4 times. I wanted him to wait. Then, I calmly tapped the green answer icon. I held the device to my ear. I spoke in a completely flat, perfectly measured, unemotional tone. "I am currently in my official period of unemployment. Please leave a message." Trenton erupted. He roared violently into the receiver like a trapped, dying animal. He completely lost any remaining shred of professional composure. He wildly accused me of intentionally planting a malicious digital virus. He threatened to immediately call the federal police. He swore loudly that he would have me thrown in a maximum security prison for severe corporate sabotage. I listened to his frantic, sweaty, pathetic threats. I took a slow, relaxing sip of my incredibly good coffee. "I did not destroy a single thing," I replied gently, keeping my voice incredibly soft and perfectly calm. "I simply stopped protecting you from your own staggering stupidity. Have a truly wonderful day." I pressed the red button. I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the wooden table. Back in the sprawling corporate command center, The absolute worst-case scenario had finally arrived. The massive digital map of North America had entirely abandoned the warning yellow color. The entire grid violently shifted into a blinding, terrifying, aggressive red. The cascade failure was no longer safely contained to just the vehicle routing nodes. The violent internal logic loops, constantly generated by the panicked artificial intelligence, began desperately seeking more processing power. The system error aggressively jumped the internal corporate firewall. It began actively and ruthlessly eating its way straight into the highly secure, heavily encrypted customer database. The heavy glass doors of the main command center were shoved open with violent, unyielding force. Chief Executive Officer Marcus had been urgently pulled from a private jet halfway across the country, his high-profile meetings entirely abandoned. There were no polite greetings. There were no firm, practiced corporate handshakes. The sprawling, aggressively modern workspace, usually a silent temple of polished arrogance, had completely transformed into an active, chaotic war zone. The perfectly calibrated climate control system could not handle the sheer amount of body heat generated by hundreds of panicking employees. The air inside the room was thick, sour, and suffocating, smelling heavily of stale sweat, burnt coffee, and absolute desperation. The massive wall monitors, previously displaying an ocean of comforting green data, now bathed the entire floor in a harsh, unforgiving, demonic red light. Desperate times usually call for incredibly expensive measures. Within the hour, an elite technology consulting firm had been airlifted directly to the corporate campus. This was a legendary group of industry fixers, heavily guarded engineers who charged several hundreds of thousands of dollars just to walk through the front lobby. They confidently marched into the command pit with their silver briefcases, practically radiating an aura of supreme intellectual superiority. They physically pushed our exhausted internal engineers aside and immediately plugged their sophisticated diagnostic equipment into the central mainframe. They treated the entire situation like a simple mathematical puzzle that simply required a superior brain to solve. Exactly 20 minutes later, the heavy, oppressive silence of impending doom settled over the consulting team. Their aggressive typing slowly ground to a complete halt. The lead consultant, an older man with deep wrinkles carved into his forehead, slowly reached up and removed his expensive wire-rimmed glasses. He let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded incredibly loud in the suffocatingly quiet room. He turned his leather chair around, looked directly at the chief executive officer, and simply shook his head. The supreme arrogance that had walked into the room with him was completely gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow look of total disbelief. "Did you locate the malicious code?" Marcus demanded, his voice dangerously low and vibrating with contained fury. "Where is the sabotage? Where is the virus she planted?" The lead consultant rubbed his tired eyes. "There is no malicious code, Marcus," he explained, his voice flat and devoid of any hope. "There is no virus. There is no hidden digital trapdoor. We scoured every single line of the foundation. She did not use any unauthorized encryption tricks to lock your systems. Your massive network is collapsing simply because it is a giant, entirely mindless machine. A machine that was literally fed and kept alive by her daily intuition, her extreme crisis management experience, and her constant, manual patch files. You built a billion-dollar tower on top of a single, highly specialized human brain. Without her specific contextual translation, the machine does not know how to perceive reality." A faint glimmer of desperate hope briefly flashed across Marcus's hardened face. "Then we just revert the system," the chief executive officer ordered firmly. "We bypass the new artificial intelligence completely, load the primary emergency backup files from yesterday, reinstall her last known stable environment. We will just eat the financial loss for today and reboot the entire grid from scratch." The consultant did not move. He looked down at his keyboard, his expression turning incredibly grim. This was the exact moment the final, fatal blow was delivered. "We cannot restore the backups," the consultant whispered, the sheer horror of the situation bleeding into his professional tone. When your vice president granted the new autonomous protocol absolute administrative control, he also gave it permission to optimize data storage. The artificial intelligence looked at her decades of manual, human-curated geographical filters, because those files did not conform to standard, predictable machine logic. The artificial intelligence categorized her entire life's work as a digital obstacle. The room became so unimaginably quiet that you could hear the soft humming of the overhead lights. The system completely erased them, the consultant finished, delivering the absolute worst news possible. The artificial intelligence permanently wiped every single manual backup, every localized context file, and every single historical safety net to free up operational memory. The legacy data is entirely gone. It is totally unrecoverable. Marcus slowly turned his head, his cold, dead eyes locked onto Trenton Vance. Trenton was no longer a vice president. He was just a terrified, pathetic man shrinking into the darkest corner of the room. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat. He had his arms wrapped tightly around his own chest, physically trying to make himself as small as humanly possible. He was waiting for Marcus to scream. He was waiting for a massive, violent explosion of executive anger. But Marcus did not yell. There was absolutely no anger left in his voice. There was only a profound, bottomless well of absolute contempt. It was a cold, quiet disgust that was infinitely more terrifying than any loud outburst. Marcus walked slowly across the room. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from the trembling man. He looked down at Trenton as if he were examining a squashed insect on the bottom of his shoe. "You did not just fire an employee," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a razor blade. "You just severed the nervous system of the entire company." The heavy, suffocating realization finally settled over every single person in that room. The damage was absolute. It was completely permanent. Even if Paisley miraculously walked back through those front doors and sat down at her desk, there was absolutely nothing she could do. The foundational soil had been permanently salted. The entire digital empire they had spent over a decade building had been thoroughly incinerated by their own blind, arrogant pursuit of artificial efficiency. The screens continued to bleed a violent red. The only thing left for them to do was to stare into the bright, burning flames and try to figure out how to rebuild an entire multi-billion-dollar logistics corporation from a useless pile of digital ashes. At exactly the moment the corrupted artificial intelligence desperately attempted to forcefully overwrite the physical hardware registries to save itself, my final, hidden safeguard engaged. It was a fail-safe protocol I had quietly coded several years ago, specifically designed to prevent the entire physical infrastructure from cannibalizing itself during a severe logic loop. The system hit the failover lock. It was a total unyielding network freeze. There were no more flashing red error messages. There were no more wailing sirens in the command center. Across 14 different time zones, every single operational monitor inside every massive AeroVantage warehouse simply clicked off. The screens went perfectly, uniformly black. The digital heartbeat of a massive empire flatlined completely. That very same afternoon, before the sun even began to set, Trenton Vance was escorted out of the grand glass atrium. He was flanked by the exact same armed security guards he had casually instructed to remove me just hours earlier. He was not carrying a heavy metal flash drive or a briefcase full of visionary corporate strategies. He held a flimsy cardboard box containing a few cheap novelty pens and a half-empty bottle of expensive cologne. His face was completely hollow. The arrogant smirk was permanently erased. As he walked across the massive asphalt parking lot, the crushing realization finally settled over him. His reputation was entirely incinerated. In the highly connected, brutally unforgiving gossip circles of Silicon Valley, he was officially marked as radioactive. His career in corporate leadership was permanently terminated. The financial markets are incredibly ruthless, and they react with the speed of light. Word of the total logistical paralysis leaked to the press almost immediately, just minutes before the official closing bell rang on the trading floor. AeroVantage stock completely cratered. It evaporated by exactly 22% of its total market value in a single, brutal downward spike, taking advantage of the absolute chaos. Their largest, most lucrative aerospace and medical partners aggressively activated the emergency termination clauses hidden deep within their contracts. They jumped ship immediately. While the boardroom was drowning in an ocean of screaming lawyers and panicked shareholders, I was sitting quietly on the small balcony of my apartment. I was watching a truly magnificent, brilliant orange sunset paint the Seattle skyline. The air was cool and incredibly peaceful. My smartphone rested gently on the glass table. It rang. The caller identification displayed a highly exclusive corporate number. I answered it. It was the Chief Technology Officer of Prime Route, the absolute largest and most aggressive competitor to AeroVantage. They had been closely monitoring the spectacular, explosive collapse of their rival all afternoon. The man on the phone did not waste any time with corporate jargon. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew exactly who had secretly kept that fragile system running perfectly for 5 long years. He offered me the position of Director of System Architecture. He offered a starting compensation package that was exactly 3 times my previous salary, fully remote, with absolute, unquestionable operational autonomy. I smiled warmly at the glowing horizon and politely accepted the job. After I ended the call, I looked down at the palm of my hand. Resting quietly against my skin was a small, encrypted backup flash drive. It contained the absolute final, flawless copy of the original algorithmic noise filters. It was the master key. It was the very essence of human intuition and hard-earned experience that a room full of highly paid executives had arrogantly dismissed as entirely replaceable. I stared at it for a long moment. Then, I walked inside, tossed it carelessly into the very back of my junk drawer, and firmly pushed it shut. The old machine was completely dead, and I had already stepped into a brand new world. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's journey satisfying and enjoyed our work, please consider supporting us. YouTube has completely cut off our funding, and our amazing team relies on this channel to feed their families and keep the lights on. A contribution of just $1 makes a massive difference. You can easily support us by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you for valuing real human effort, and we will see you in the next story.